Hi, Yinnies. Welcome if you're new around here, or if you're a familiar, welcome back. We haven't met before. My name is Nick Danu, and I am a Yin yoga teacher trainer, yoga business mentor, and I teach the general public as well. So that's just me in a nutshell. I wanted to pop in and introduce not just today's episode, but also the one that will follow it with a bit of a theme. I have a couple episodes back to back under the similar theme. And I naively thought I could get all of these in one episode, but that is not turning out to be the case. So there will be a little mini series. And the subject is Yoga Alliance. So I'll talk in the second part of this first episode about my own story with Yoga Alliance and why I don't use or support Yoga Alliance, but I'll get into that in that part. This, I wanted to just serve as an introduction to the two-part series. So there will be this week's episode with an interview with Suzanne Doolin, whose bio I will read in a moment. So she will start off the series, and then you'll hear from me. And then in the second episode, I have two more guests as well. That'll be the following week. So I'll introduce them in that one. But I just wanted to plant the seed that this is a two-parter, this Yoga Alliance series. And I always intended to do a podcast on Yoga Alliance, an episode on the Yoga Alliance. And then actually it was requested as well. So did you know that you can make requests for the podcast? You can. All you have to do is just find me on Instagram and send me a DM. I'm happy to add them to my little ever-growing list in my phone of podcast episodes. Okay. Let's not carry on with chatting. I'm going to read Suzanne Doolin's bio, and then the next time that you hear from me, I'll be joined by Suzanne. So Suzanne Doolin currently lives in Fernandina Beach, Florida. She's a longtime yoga teacher with a background in Iyengar and Usara and Kripalu styles of yoga. She's Florida's only authorized freedom teacher. Her mentor is yoga master Eric Schiffman has personally given her permission to teach his training materials. She believes that everybody has an important lesson to teach. Her lesson is to guide others using a step-by-step process to develop their own voices. For Eric Schiffman, Suzanne moderated the Moving into Stillness discussion board, which was an active online community that attracted many yoga teachers. In the thousands of posts she read and replied to, she spoke with yogis all over the world who were struggling to make a living doing what they love. Suzanne also struggled with making a living teaching. She was the original founder of the Wilmington Yoga Center Cooperative in Wilmington, North Carolina. But when her home went into foreclosure, she had to lessen her teaching commitments and return to full-time salaried work in the field of engineering. Because it was important to her to make sure that her daughter and her were well provided for, she spent 10 years working full-time in engineering, writing books and creating e-courses and producing videos. And during this time, she learned two life-changing skills that she now brings to the yoga world: professional teaching methodology, which she learned as a full-time e-course creator, and business startup tools, which she learned in her Master's of Engineering Management program. Suzanne now works full-time as a yoga teacher and a business coach. In her business, Get a Bigger Boat, Suzanne helps anybody who wants to make a living as a yoga teacher using a structured approach. She coaches teachers to consistently deliver on the promises that they make to their students, which gives them confidence to sell their programs with integrity. She helps teachers develop their offerings and design their own unique learning curricula and create online courses. So that's Suzanne Doolin. And when you hear from me next, you'll get to hear from her yourself. Hi, welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you. It's nice to meet you, Nick.
Yes, we have only connected virtually in Facebook groups before, so it's lovely to be voice to voice, face to face, at least on Zoom. Um, can you briefly introduce yourself and the work that you do and who you work with?
Sure. My name's Suzanne Doolin. I'm the founder of Get a Bigger Boat. I teach yoga. I've been a longtime yoga teacher, teaching yoga and meditation. I study many different styles, but the person I'm most associated with is Eric Schiffman, who wrote the book Yoga, the Spirit and Practice of Moving into Stillness. I ran his discussion board, the Moving into Stillness discussion board, for many years, and it was a super active community, primarily of yoga teachers all over the world. And so that gave me a lot of insight into the concerns that yoga teachers have, and it shaped my experience of what I was seeking. I also have worked in the field of engineering for many years, and I was a professional learning designer, and I just helped to design a certification course. The courses that I worked on were used to help certify people to industry standards. And that experience gave me a lot of information about what I saw was missing in yoga teaching. The
Mm.
questions that people were really struggling with, I started to see a lot of answers in that field of learning design.
Just so that the listeners know, how I discovered you was through a yoga teacher Facebook group. And you had posted, and I don't remember how long ago this was, you may, but a video about Yoga Alliance. And that's the reason that I wanted to bring you on, because when I watched your video, I was really struck with how just matter of a fact it was. It
Thank you.
was like a piece of investigative journalism. Whereas oftentimes when yogis start talking about Yoga Alliance, it gets really snippy. Like everyone's so opinionated and there's strong opinions and sometimes emotional content that goes with it, that there isn't really a good resource, I think, for someone who is either looking for a teacher training program and considering whether or not it being registered with Yoga Alliance is important, or is a new teacher and maybe they were with Yoga Alliance, but their program was, but should they register? There isn't a lot of resources out there for them to just actually see what it is, what it isn't, what are the benefits, what are the deficits, what's needed, what's not needed. And I just thought that your video, which for those of you listening or watching, I will connect the link to that video in the show notes so that you can watch it. Some of the standards may have changed, and I know you can update us a little bit since
Mhm.
that video, but I just thought it was so well done as far as here's just the nuts and bolts of here's what it is, here's what it isn't. So that's why I wanted to have you on as like the first guest in this little
Thank you.
multi-guest episode, just to really lay the groundwork of what is Yoga Alliance actually, and what isn't it, which is what a lot of people, there's a lot of misconceptions, right, in the yogaverse about what Yoga Alliance is and is not. So maybe I'll get you started with that if you don't mind.
Sure, that would be great. And I want to start with something that I think a lot of people haven't really thought about, which is, what does it mean to learn? Like, what does it mean to know something? And I, as a learning professional, had to be able to describe that to people. So when we know something, it's like when we go through that transformation, it's a transformative process. So, for example, if you can remember when you learned to drive, there was probably a moment where you just felt like it all
Mm-hmm.
clicked, and
Mm-hmm.
now you know how to drive. And even if you like don't drive for 5 years, you get back in a car, it might be a little rusty at first, but you would still know how to drive. It would be there,
Mm-hmm.
you would know it. That's what knowing is. And learning is that process of getting there. And learning is a step-by-step process, and we know what those steps are to reach that level of learning. So then, as a teacher, our role as teachers is to help people to get to that moment, that light bulb moment where the penny drops, and suddenly there's that shift, and now they know it, and it's in their body. It's something
Mm-hmm.
that you could never take away.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about the Yoga Alliance and their standards, the 200-hour standard, first of all, does not require that you actually know yoga, like that you have any kind of moment before you came to be a teacher that would give you that knowledge that would make it possible for you to transfer that knowledge to someone else. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a huge, huge issue with the 200-hour standards is there's no prerequisite.
Before we get into the
Mhm.
standards, maybe it might be useful to actually just even say, what is Yoga Alliance
Yeah,
for
that would
those
be
that are like, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions, um, mostly, I'm going to say mostly by new teachers because they just haven't heard enough various points of view on it to know
Mhm.
that it might not be what they think it is. But I think there's just a lot of misconceptions about what Yoga Alliance
Mhm.
is and what it isn't. So maybe we'll start there and then we
Okay.
can dive into the
So
standards.
it's an industry trade group, but it doesn't have a lot of things that you would expect an industry trade group to have. So it has some of those things, but basically it's the largest industry trade group for yoga, and it's in the United States, and it's really become the default worldwide. From what I understand, talking with people in other countries, they are also pretty much going to the Yoga Alliance standards of training. And this industry group, it recognizes teachers as having credentials, but it does not certify those people to those credentials, which we'll talk a little bit about what is certification. But
Mm-hmm.
they are the people that say what the standards are for teaching. And then they also tell the schools have to register with the Yoga Alliance in order to prepare people to get those credentials or that designation of registered yoga teacher.
Yeah, I would say they're not being a non-American in the conversation. I would say that in Canada, definitely most people, even though we have our own alliance, heads up Canadians, we have a Canadian Yoga Alliance that's not affiliated, that most people do go with Yoga Alliance. But when I talk to actually most of my European friends, they have their own bodies that they're using. Like Yoga
There's
Alliance
the
kind
British
of.
Wheel of Yoga
Yeah,
is
and I mean,
there.
it seems like in Europe, a lot of the countries will have their own, or they have nothing at all. Um,
And
so I think
India has, I believe, some kind
yes,
of state credential
yeah,
license that you get through India. So there's other ones, but
yeah,
it's still a big deal worldwide. I
for
was
sure.
surprised how much um, worldwide people are registering with it. And I thought it was only United States when I first started exploring it.
Mhm.
And I learned that it's really pretty, not universal, but it's the largest industry group in the world for yoga teachers.
They definitely have a monopoly.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, just to make this real plain speak. So you said it's a trade organization,
Hmm.
which if other people aren't familiar with that, if they've never been in a trade, I have. I was a hairstylist for 12 years.
Oh,
So
that's
it's like,
perfect.
yeah, it's like although hairdressers are licensed, so where
Yes,
I'm from anyway,
exactly.
so slightly different, but it's like an association
Yes.
for the yoga teachers.
But I will say there's a difference because you were licensed and you had to have that license in order to practice. Like you
Yes,
couldn't legally
yes,
cut
yeah,
hair as a profession. And there's nowhere at least in the United States, where there is a legal requirement to teach
yes.
yoga.
Which, we could debate whether or not we should license yoga teachers. That would be an episode for another time. But that's what I mean is that, I had trade organizations that I was part of as a hairstylist, but the government was actually who certified me. Yeah. The other
Yes.
organizations were just like you said, they were trade organizations that you could join and they had benefits to joining them or not, and you could not join them. But it was actually the government that licensed me as a hairstylist, not the trade organization. And I
Yes.
think that's something that because yoga teachers at this point are not licensed,
Okay.
that's something that often is misunderstood I think that a lot of, especially new yoga teachers, think that Yoga Alliance is a certifying body or a licensing body, and they're
Yeah,
not.
and so I want to talk about what does that mean? And I
Yeah,
talked to early on that I worked on a certification program.
beautiful.
So certification, it means something very specific in the education industry, and it means that there's a test. And generally, it would be an independent test. For example, in order to be a teacher, like in a school, you have to take an exam and get licensed as a teacher. And that exam isn't administered by your school that trained you, it's administered by a certifying body.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So there's an independence to it. And in the yoga world, there is no certification. There isn't a test. There's no testing standard. Although I will say that the Yoga Alliance is now requiring testing. And that was, yeah, and I was really happy to see that. I cannot find out any information about what their testing requirements are, but they are, at the very least, they are now requiring some testing. So I was very happy to hear that, but it is still not a certification test. There's no national or international standard certification test. It is called a registered yoga teacher, not a certified yoga teacher for a reason. It simply means that you're on a list.
and I think that it's confusing even to myself sometimes, this word certified, because of course people will go to their training, right? And then they'll get a certificate, which leads them to believe I am now certified. And well, you might be certified by that yoga school. Like they're
Mhm.
giving you their stamp of approval, but that's not like a citywide, state or province wide, countrywide, worldwide, anything. I know it sounds weird to like pick these words apart so much, but I think this is where some of the misunderstanding comes from. A certificate saying you completed the course is not the same as a certificate saying you are now licensed to go ahead and do this.
That's correct. Then many,
Brilliant.
many industries have licensing boards. And there was the people who founded the Yoga Alliance, my understanding was they they didn't want, they very specifically were doing this to prevent
Mm-hmm.
there being state regulation of yoga, which I don't, you know, I kind of think is cool. The problem is that they didn't tell the yoga teachers that. And so, a lot of the new yoga teachers have this misunderstanding that it's a certifying body
Yeah. And I
and
think
that
that
they need
actually
a
that's one of the best things historically, and I can't remember the years that that happened, that Yoga Alliance did in the past was actually stand up for yoga teachers
Mhm.
when government bodies were trying to come in and make everybody licensed.
Some people that I know who are in like the massage industry. I've heard this conversation in the massage industry
Yeah.
where I think certification really helped them because they have
Yes.
to like,
Yes.
message themselves against sex workers. And so it really, made a big
Yeah.
difference to have this professional certification. But, what I've heard from people is that often like there's a big school or there's a big business and all the board kind of ends up being the people on the biggest businesses and it becomes a bit of a way to bully smaller businesses.
Yeah.
So I think that there was I actually like the fact that they didn't do it, and but I have some ideas about what I think should be offered instead.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I don't like is that there's the perception that it's a
Yes.
certifying body
That's
and that
that's
they don't do a lot to, dispel that notion.
if anything, they kind of do the opposite,
Yeah.
Yeah, in their marketing and their presentation. It's like if you didn't know, if you didn't as a new teacher, if you didn't know and you didn't do some research and you didn't hear other voices that were like ours that are like, whoa, hey, you don't need to do that, you would never know. You would assume that by registering with them, that means you're now certified and now you're too legit to quit, and that's all you need to do. This is one of the reasons that I really wanted to have you on, is because I really feel like your voice is just factual with all of this,
Yeah.
because we do tend to in the yoga world get a little heated with this topic, myself included. So maybe now would be a good time to just kind of talk about, so we kind of summarized what Yoga Alliance is and what
Mhm.
it's not, and then we can briefly talk about the standards
Sure.
and whether or not what changes have made, and maybe we can even talk about whether or not we think that's enough.
Well, I'm before I get into the standards, I want to give you some information that I think every yoga teacher needs to know and teachers need to know in general. So one of the biggest issues that people have around how do we assess yoga teachers is that for most of us, our schooling has been in what's called the cognitive domain. That is,
Hmm.
that we went to school and we took a written test.
Hmm.
And so I think there's a lot of frustration that people, a lot of yoga is in what's called the psychomotor domain, the physical domain. We're teaching physical skills. And if we did learn physical skills, it might have been like within a sport, but there wasn't usually some kind of test of our ability. And
Right.
then there's another domain of learning, which is called I usually call it the habitual domain, like it has some different names, but it means acquiring a habit. And there's actually steps of learning are known. So like I gave the example early on of like if you were to drive a car, you would get to that point where you really knew it and you understood it. The first step of learning a physical skill is just to observe somebody doing it and then to mimic them, copy them.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then you do it on your own, like with cues,
Hmm.
becoming more fluent. And then
Hmm.
you do it, there's more sequencing, more chaining skills together. And then you get to the point where it's just in your body, you can flow and you can be creative.
Hmm.
That skill set is something that actually can be observed. You can't test like a written test, but you can observe whether somebody has gone through those steps.
Yeah.
And you can see it if you're knowledgeable. And then with the habitual domain, you're looking at acquiring habits, and it's very similar. Somebody is observing, they like basically are being told what to do and just doing their best to apply it. And then over time, they actually move into a teaching role, become peer mentors, and they
Hmm.
become more influential within their community. And that's part of the adoption of a habit. And that's why people want to become yoga teachers, because it helps them to acquire the habit. And they know that and they understand it. So when we talk about these requirements, what you see is that they're all in the cognitive domain. They're all, knowledge, skilled knowledge.
Hmm.
So they have techniques, training, and practice. So there's asana, anatomy, and physiology. So there's 75 hours of techniques, training, and practice, 30 hours of anatomy and physiology, 30 hours of yoga humanities, which is like history, and then 50 hours of professional essentials. So teaching, like teaching methodology. This is a big improvement over what it was. These are things that can be tested. I do believe that they observe asana. There's no prerequisites. So really it's kind of like almost what this is more of, I mean, it teaches you some basic teaching skill sets, but in a lot of ways it's what should be like sort of beginner yoga, like testing somebody, assessing people. There's no assessment coming into all of this. So
This is such a good point, because one of the trends that I've seen since I took my first teacher training that has really distressed me, I guess it's sort of a distressing thing, is that because if someone has a teacher training and they register with Yoga Alliance, unless they themselves, so I'll just use myself as an example, a pretend example, because this isn't me, but let's just say I want to teach a 200-hour training and I'm registered with Yoga Alliance. I can go onto their website. I can figure out what are the boxes I need to check to put into that training. What are the boxes I need professionally to be able to do this according to Yoga Alliance?
yeah,
But what Yoga Alliance does not have as one of those requirements is any sort of an application process
yeah,
for the people coming in. So when I took my first teacher training, we had a pretty hefty application process. First of all, we had to put dates as to when we started practicing and who our first teacher was. I needed a letter from that first teacher saying that they thought I would be suitable for the program. So I needed a certain amount of experience as far as like how long have I been practicing yoga. I needed a letter from a recommending teacher. And then I also needed to write an essay on why I wanted to join the teacher training and why I wanted to teach yoga if I did. And there were people in my program who took it thinking they didn't want to be teachers and they were still allowed in, but you still had to have the letter from a recommending teacher. And I can't remember how many years of experience it was in order to even be considered. And this and mentorship. So, most of us have our 200 hour, but like there's no before you get to the 200 hour. And then there's no after for most people. It's just
Right.
kind of like join the 200 hour. Okay, you graduated. Let's throw you to the wolves, figure it out. So, what happens now is you get a lot of people that are inexperienced in yoga and don't really understand what yoga is. They are going to their 200 hour because they have some sort of Instagram influencer lifestyle version of what yoga is in their head. And that's what they want to do. They haven't been practicing long enough with enough teachers in a diverse enough way that they actually even have an understanding of what yoga is. And then they enter their 200 hour where they just get a certain amount. And then they're kind of left on their own with no
Yeah.
mentorship. And I really think that this is where, if Yoga Alliance could step up, this is where I'd like to see them step up. Is I would like to see, if you want to have a Yoga Alliance registered program, that there has to be some pre-requirements for people for entry, and then there has to be some sort of a mentorship.
Yeah.
Because right now what's happening is we're just getting a bunch of undertrained teachers that are, some of them are quite young too in their experience
Hmm.
level, being sort of just tossed out into the wilderness of the yoga world and then wondering why they can't figure it out.
So I see happening in yoga teacher training programs is two things. One, there's people who like will go into these yoga teacher training programs with very little experience, and they do it generally not necessarily even wanting to be a teacher, but just thinking like, well, I just want to get the knowledge, a more structured knowledge of yoga, because they rightly see that there's a lack of structure in how it's taught,
Mm-hmm.
and they see that it's a skill set, and they understand that they can't acquire the skill set just by attending class,
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
because it's not being taught in a structured way.
Mm-hmm.
So they want it in a structured way and they go, but they're not even necessarily looking to be a teacher, but then maybe they're encouraged to be a teacher, or now they are registered, not certified, but they have a certificate that says that they're a teacher, and they somehow end up in a teaching situation. And then the other thing that happens, and this is a lot, the people I work with are the people who love yoga. They had very, very good teachers. They go to teacher training and they are so overqualified for the teacher training that they come out of it with like nothing. My first teacher training program, I was teaching level 4 Iyengar classes at the time, and pretty much everything that I learned in the yoga teacher training program was just whatever I was already being taught in my class that I was taking. Like I was in a class with people who, there was one person there who I'd never seen her at the school. As far as I
Mm-hmm.
know, she had never ever taken any yoga classes. you know,
Wow.
and years
I
ago, there weren't
Yeah.
really, but there's no prerequisites still. And so you end up with this situation where you get people who are sort of, not given enough and then
Mm-hmm.
are teaching, and then
Mm-hmm.
teachers who go through the training program and they don't feel that they went through the transformation to actually learn to teach.
Yes.
And so then they're like struggling figuring out. I just see it all the time. People say they don't feel ready to teach after they got
Oh, all the
through
time. Yeah.
a teacher
What
training
a
program.
simple solution to this would be if these studios offered, and I've known a couple studios that have done it, offer what they call a yoga immersion
Yes,
for
I've seen that.
everybody. Anybody who loves yoga, whether they've been doing it for 2 weeks or whether they've been doing it for 10 years, who wants to learn more about the philosophy, more about the history. You can do a lot of that stuff in that yoga immersion and then have that yoga immersion be a prerequisite for your 200 hours so that by the time they get to the 200 hour, they're now learning how to teach,
Yeah.
and deeper anatomy and things like that as well, because the average civilian probably doesn't want to know anatomy that deep. But if you could offer like 100-hour yoga immersion, then first of all, the people that have just wanted to learn more are just going to be like, thank you very much. Now I'm going to
Yes.
continue with my yoga and I'm going to go to retreats. And then the people who truly do want to teach after they've actually learned about the history of yoga and, the philosophies, if they're like, oh my gosh, I'm even more excited to teach now, then they invest in an actual teacher
Yeah.
training program, which in my opinion should include mentorship.
I think that we should be looking at the martial arts world
Yes.
for how they've done it, because in martial arts, there's assessment at every step along the way. And one of the values of that is that when you assess, I talked about there's these two people who are basically underqualified and people who are overqualified. And the people who are underqualified they get told you're not ready. And the people who are overqualified, they get pushed along to like go into where they should be
Hmm.
appropriately.
Yeah.
That like it's helping them to gain that courage. And the role of the teacher should be to help students see where they are in their learning process.
At
I
least in
really
the
like that there's that independent assessment over and over again.
and at least if there was some sort of an immersion at the beginning, I think that at least we would have a better, not a guarantee, but a better assurance that the people that then move into teacher training really do have the utmost love and respect for yoga, and that they
Yes.
really are passionate about it, as opposed to it just being like, oh my God, I want free leggings and I want to like roll up with my green smoothie and just like be an influencer. If you want to be an influencer, rock on with yourself, but don't bring yoga into it. Like learn about the history, the philosophy, all of that, and then decide, oh, okay, I didn't realize this was what yoga was. A lot of teachers, a lot of people are like, I had no idea this is what yoga was. And they're just all about the asana. It's a way to kind of filter out. That's a better word. I was going to say weed out, but filter out people who either aren't going to take it seriously, or people who are just want to learn more, but they know they have no desire to teach, and then they get this gift of deepening their own understanding and journey with yoga without feeling like they need to learn to teach.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people who are younger, they see that yoga is a path to understand their self. And
Yeah.
yeah, I think that experimenting with things is a part of that. And I think us as teachers should be understanding that.
Yeah, and I think having an immersion process would give them that opportunity for those who want it.
Yeah. But I just think that as teachers should be recognizing that, like, we're going to be teaching young people, and it's okay that that maybe some of their intentions are just not so clear. But I think that we should be able to help them. And I think that we need something that gives us more security in ourselves. For myself, what I believe brings that is not a certification or a piece of paper, but an understanding of teaching
Yes.
and being really good teachers. But I will say that a very good teaching program will change your life, and we
100%.
should have more of those.
I agree. It's total transformation. I in my previous career was a hairstylist, as I mentioned, but I was also an educator. So I worked for a hair color company and taught everything from basic like color theory, here's how we cancel out tones, color wheel stuff, to like advanced hair color technique. And so I got my teaching chops there long before I became a yoga teacher. So I was already very comfortable standing in front of the room, understanding different learning styles, making sure that people had like different ways that we were learning the information. I remember being in my first teacher training, having already been teaching and feeling so much compassion for the other teachers that didn't have that, because
Yes.
not only did they have to get up in front of the group and remember their cues and look at bodies and do all the things that I had to do, but they also had that feeling of public speaking, being at the front of the
Yes.
room, imposter syndrome. Like they also had that whole thing that they had to deal with. And I think that also speaks to the role of mentorship, because I do mentor teachers who are highly trained teachers as far as our industry goes. Some of them they're incredibly young and passionate, who have graduated even their yoga therapy certification. So they have all the knowledge, the book stuff, right? But what they're missing is, okay, and how do I use any of this? And what do I do when this situation happens in class? And how
Yeah.
do I talk to the studio manager about this? And what do you think of this sequence? And so I mentor newer teachers. I do think that that is really, really missing from the standards. If Yoga Alliance is listening, dear Yoga Alliance, number one, please bring back grandfathering. I'll rant more about that when I
I would
share my
love that
rant
because,
about that when
I'm not grandfathered in.
ditto.
You know,
I'll yeah,
I have some crazy certification, well,
I'll be
pieces of paper.
I'll be going into that in depth when I do my own solo part. So bring back grandfathering, number one. Have some sort of a prerequisite included in your standards
Yes.
or teacher training programs. And then number three, have mentorship
Yes.
as a part of your teacher training. And then I think what we're going to get is people who are so much more confident and also so much more skilled at teaching by the time they go through that than what we're seeing now.
Yes, I would love to see that. I will say that since I did that video, there's a couple of things that they've done that I'm really happy to see. And one of them is that they now have some, I think it's what I said, it was 50 hours of requirement around teaching methodologies. I don't know exactly what's getting taught there, but it's nice to see that a quarter of the time has to be focused on how you teach.
Mm-hmm,
And I
mm-hmm.
think that was really missing before. It used to be that the schools would get approved, and then a lot of times very common for the lead teachers to leave because it's very difficult to make a living as a teacher. So somebody would set it up and then they'd have to go back and get a real job or something. And then the studio would continue to run the teacher training program without the lead teachers. Um, and there was never a recertification. So I noticed that now they're requiring you to pay a fee every year to stay certified, and you have to like resubmit your program every, I think it's like after 2 years or something. So I was very happy to see that because that was a huge issue that
Mm-hmm.
schools would, they would have a teacher who would set it up, they would receive the approval to get people as registered yoga teachers, and then they would continue to run this training program, but it wasn't the same program,
Mm-hmm.
and there was nobody checking. So
Yeah.
at the very least, they've got a mechanism now where people have to at least upload a curriculum. Now, is there somebody going around and checking
No.
to see? No. There, enforcement is a big issue across all industries, and there's always a tension because people make the money by giving people pieces of paper, and so
Yes.
they don't want to crack down on it.
But
Yeah.
like you said, having to register and then actually having it be trackable in any way is a different story. But at least it's like a tiny toe in the water of
Yeah.
more accountability.
Yep, they're doing more. I feel like they're going in the right direction. I think ultimately there's still issues with it, but I think people are still feeling like there's more of a real professional path now. I do a lot of business coaching, and I do that because I think if you want to be a professional, you have to make it your business.
Yeah.
And that I felt like people needed to understand how you could make a business as a teacher.
Yeah.
And I feel like that piece of it is still really missing from
Definitely.
the Yoga Alliance as
I
a
also
whole.
do business mentorship with teachers. Yes, I totally agree. Even in my teacher training, I think we got 3 hours of like professional or business stuff. And it was like, get insurance, get an accountant. Like
Yes.
it was like ridiculous. It was like, right. And how do I get hired somewhere?
There's the misperception that you can get hired at a studio and make a living at it. And a lot of people are
Mhm.
really disappointed to learn that it's just physically not possible to teach enough classes at a studio to make a living.
Not nowadays, no. I think there was at one point many, many years ago, but at this point in the game, no,
Yeah.
especially with what we've been through in the last few years and so many studios closing. It's like even if you physically could teach enough classes to make a living, there aren't enough places anymore for you to do so.
Yeah.
So yeah, it does. I think business training is another thing that's seriously lacking
Yeah, I
in
believe
our
that
industry.
what you really need is to be able to run your own small business in order
Yeah,
to make a living as a teacher. That's what I've
yeah,
concluded from
100%.
talking with people. What I've heard from people that there's still a lack of clarity about how they achieve these standards because they elevated all the standards and then the schools, they have to meet these standards and
Yeah.
they have to adjust their curricula. And it's not quite clear exactly how they do that.
And what I have noticed is that some do that. They continue to evolve. And I've also noticed a mass exodus um, of many teachers that I know. I've noticed many teachers just say, you know what, I'm not playing that game anymore. I'm done. Like, I'm going to keep running teacher trainings in my own way, and I'm going to do what I think is important. And because there's so many limitations over here that I've seen so many individual teachers, but also teachers that train teachers and offer continuing ed for teachers, just leave Yoga Alliance altogether and just be like, I'm
Well,
just going to do my thing.
so wonderful that you're creating this way for these voices to come together and be heard, and then for people to actually discover teachers who are all offering an alternative.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that yoga, the whole goal of yoga is for us to have this inner realization of ourselves and to develop our own teachings, like that we pass on.
Yes.
And so to me, I have an issue with just the idea that there's a set curriculum that we're supposed to take and regurgitate.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we should be taught how to interact critically with the material that we're learning and then shown how we develop our own teaching. That's what I work on.
That sounds like the perfect place to wrap it up. I love that thought. It gave me a little warm fuzzies. If you don't mind, just quickly, I will, of course, link all your stuff in the show
Sure.
notes, but just let everybody know where they can find you online and how you might be able to help them.
Yeah. So online, it's getabiggerboat.com. And I help people to create online training. I have a program that does that. I also do business coaching and I teach yoga online.
I'll link your website below. And I know that a lot of yoga teachers need help with how to create courses. So it'll be a good
Yes.
resource for them.
Yes. One of the things that I try to teach in my program where I teach people how to create a course is A, how you make a living as a teacher, but B, how you can, the limitations of online teaching and then the strengths of it and how you can
Mm-hmm.
use those. So,
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your
okay.
time. It was lovely
Thank
to meet
you.
you face to face. And we'll definitely leave everything in the show notes. Okay. So, my story with Yoga Alliance. Now that we've had a chance to hear from Suzanne, I thought that it would be a good time for me to share my story. So, when I graduated my first teacher training in 2004, I had to think about that. So, my first teacher training, I graduated in 2004, and it was a 300-hour teacher training program. Now, some of you who are very Yoga Alliance versed might be like, wait, what? Your first one was a 300? Yes, we'll get to that. It was a really good program, really good foundation. It had 200 hours of sort of one weekend a month or 2 weekends a month. I can't remember. It was a long time ago of training. And then we also had 25 hours of what was called assisting and observing. So we did that while we were in our program. We chose a teacher who we really liked or several teachers, and we did some assisting and observing. Basically, we sat at the front of the room with a pen and a book, and we helped them clean up props and we got to ask them questions. So it was a really good opportunity, even while I was still in my training, to sit at the front of the room and to experience what it's like to be a teacher at the front of the room, which is very different than when we're in our teacher training. I think a lot of yoga teachers realize when they graduate, if they didn't have any opportunities to be at the front of the room before they finish their program, how different it is to teach a bunch of yoga teacher trainees versus the general public. So that was one of the things I loved about that program. And then at the end of our training, as far as our weekends modules, we were to choose a teacher, and we were one teacher, and we were to apprentice with them for, I think it was 75 hours. And so that's what I did. So that's how it ended up being a 300-hour program, because it was 200 of sort of weekend modules. And then we had this mentorship aspect as well, which was, again, an invaluable gift. Now, back in 2004, where I'm from in Canada, originally born and raised in Calgary, Alberta, Yoga Alliance wasn't really a thing. Like, it was sort of around somewhere, but nobody that I knew registered with Yoga Alliance. It was starting to happen more in the States, but it was still very unheard of. It wasn't the big behemoth that it is now. And so I never bothered to register with Yoga Alliance back then because, first of all, it was American centric, meaning most of it was in the US. And I literally didn't see any advantage to registering with them. Now, in my province, there was also an Alberta Yoga Alliance. Or, sorry, not Yoga Alliance. I misspoke there. It was a Alberta Yoga Teachers Association, I believe is what it was. And I could have registered with them, but I didn't. I looked at kind of what you got for your dues, and it resulted in a newsletter, and that you would be on some sort of registry somewhere saying that you were registered with them. Notice I said registered with them, not certified by them. And so I decided to skip that because it just didn't seem relevant. It didn't seem like that would help my career at all. And when I lived in Calgary, because the very first teacher training program I took and the studio I took it at had a good reputation, if I was going from studio to studio with my resume as a new budding teacher trying to get classes, I really didn't need an outside sort of stamp of approval, because the studio itself and that program had a really good reputation. So it was well known in the city. It had a good reputation. And so the fact that I had graduated that program and finished that program was sort of the only stamp of approval I really needed to start looking around. So that's how I started. And the other reason I didn't register with the Alberta Yoga Alliance is because it was just in Alberta. And I thought, if I move, then that's not very useful. So fast forward many, many years. I've now been teaching for several years. I have been, full-time teaching in Calgary for many years, doing it full-time, running all my own classes, etc. So I slowly built up my business. I won't bore you with all the business stuff, but slowly built up my business and was an actually successful full-time yoga teacher, running all of my own classes. And I was teaching full-time, still not registered with Yoga Alliance. Then I decided to move to British Columbia, which is where I live now. And when I moved here, I realized that, first of all, the very first teacher training program that I took is actually no longer around in that way. Now, the primary director of it does still train teachers, but that program under that studio's name is no longer. So there's that. Plus, I realized that here in Victoria, British Columbia, nobody knew about that studio from Calgary. Nobody knew what a great program that was. And so although I had, that program, as well as a few hundred hours with Paul Grilly at that point already under my belt, I wasn't registered with Yoga Alliance. And I thought, well, now that I'm actually kind of starting over, I've gone from full-time yoga entrepreneur, building my own classes. I've moved to this little island. I'm going back to school full-time and don't have the time to try to build and run my own classes from the ground up. So I was applying to different studios. I thought, well, maybe now there would be an advantage to registering with Yoga Alliance, simply because nobody knows me. Nobody knows my first teacher training program. They don't know my credentialing, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought, as well as my many years of experience at this point, maybe I should, register with Yoga Alliance. So I hopped on to Yoga Alliance's website. And the first thing that I noticed is that although they used to have a grandparenting program, if you're not familiar with this term, I'm using the gender neutral version of grandfathering, which basically Yoga Alliance used to have the ability for teachers who had been teaching for a long time, like before Yoga Alliance was even around, to sort of submit some paperwork with their credentialing. Somebody at Yoga Alliance would look it over and say, okay, yeah, we can give you our Yoga Alliance stamp based on the training and experience, et cetera, that you have. So they used to do that. But at this point, when I was looking into it, they no longer did. And so if I were to register with Yoga Alliance, they were not going to include or count my first 300-hour training or my first 8 years of full-time teaching experience. I wasn't able to register any of that because they no longer had this grandparenting program in. So I would have only been able to register my yin training with Paul Grillet, which meant that instead of being way past a experienced registered 500-hour teacher, which is what I actually had the credentialing for, I would have been only able to do a experienced 200-hour teacher. So my whole first 300 hours was not counted, nor was my 8 years of teaching experience. And this is when I decided, nah, I'm not going to register with Yoga Alliance. For me, any governing body, which, by the way, I just misspoke because Yoga Alliance is not a governing body. To me, if there's any registry for professionals that does not include grandfathering, then I'm not supporting that. So somebody could have been teaching yoga, for example, for those of you that are newer teachers, you're still not quite catching what this means. Your teacher's teacher's teacher can't register with Yoga Alliance. All of those amazing teachers in India that all of my teachers and then their teachers studied under cannot register with Yoga Alliance. So this so-called credentialing system doesn't acknowledge any experience or training that happened before Yoga Alliance existed. They used to, but they don't anymore. And they don't include all of those years of experience. So if I was able to go back and I still have it, the syllabus of my very first 300-hour, and submit that and submit, all of my teaching hours and student testimonials and, maybe a letter from places that I've taught at as a way of sort of proving my credentials to Yoga Alliance. If I was able to bundle all that together and submit it to them and then get approved, I would have been a registered or an experienced registered 500-hour teacher, I think is the languaging they use. Now, they don't do anything over 500, which is also a problem for me. So I would have been way over an experienced registered 500 with the experience, the years of study and the trainings that I had, but they don't have anything higher than that. But because they don't have grandparenting in, I couldn't register at that level. And to register at a 200 level, when really you should be like at the highest level of experience, just felt like a big slap in the face. To have devoted so much time to teaching yoga full time, blood, sweat, tears, eat, sleep, breathe yoga, many years of teaching with my students, now training teachers and apprenticing teachers, and not be able to qualify because they don't acknowledge a training that was around and created before Yoga Alliance was a thing, just frankly was so ridiculous that I decided to opt out. Now, this isn't unusual behavior for me. I'm a big believer that one of the few ways that we have any sort of voice in our world and in our culture is by what we choose to support and what we choose not to support. So I make a practice of doing my best and still living in this mad world that we all live in, to not put my money where my heart isn't. So if I don't believe in something, I'm not buying it. And so that's kind of where Yoga Alliance fell for me. It became pretty clear that Yoga Alliance actually wasn't interested in registering highly qualified, highly trained teachers as much as they were interested in collecting the money from teachers and also from colleges, yoga trainings, and yoga colleges. So then there's that part of the coin. So I didn't register as a teacher because it was a slap in the face, to be frank, to ignore my first 8+ years experience and my first 300-hour completely when I was registering. And then the other side of that coin is for those of us who do train teachers. If you register with Yoga Alliance and you train teachers, there's a lot of hoops to jump through about you have to have this many hours of this and this many hours of that. And again, I'm not going to get into all of the standards because, first of all, I don't know them because I don't pay that much attention. Secondly, they could change, and we may discuss them briefly, with Suzanne, and I'll include her older video as well, just so because I think it's a great video, but the standards change, which is another problem. The standards keep changing. So what I realized is that Yoga Alliance, the stamp of Yoga Alliance actually on a certificate means nothing. If you could have somebody who's been teaching for over 30 years and has directly studied in India under multiple very skilled teachers, probably some of them deceased now, who cannot be grandparented into Yoga Alliance, and yet somebody can take a 200-hour teacher training online and never have even seen the director of that program in person and get a Yoga Alliance stamp of approval, that's a problem. So the way that they do their credentialing is frankly ridiculous. Secondly, the other thing I don't love about Yoga Alliance is I think the standards are way too low. First of all, this 200 hours, I don't know where this came from, but I'm pretty sure that either Yoga Alliance or somebody early on in the creation of Yoga Alliance created this 200-hour standard. Frankly, it's not enough. It's not nearly enough. As a yoga professional who has, and if you are a 200-hour yoga teacher right now, I'm not dissing you, not at all. You went and researched and you took your program and it was probably a decent program. I'm just saying 200 only shouldn't have been an option, that we should raise the bar, and that as yoga professionals, even our first training should be much longer, much more in-depth, especially for what we do for a living, right? So I'm not dissing you, dear 200-hour teacher. I'm dissing the system. So I think that a 200-hour is ridiculously low. And I think that what Yoga Alliance decides is most important to have this many hours of this and this many hours of that is ridiculous as well. And these are arbitrary standards that some board of directors or some panel of people at Yoga Alliance decided, oh, this is what's important. And yet, most 200 hours have almost no mentorship, almost no assisting and observing, where the new teachers are sitting at the front of the room with their teacher. They don't have any apprenticeship or mentorship afterwards. And so what's happening with this system is there's a whole bunch of people that love yoga, that get excited about wanting to be a yoga teacher. They find a teacher training, they take their 200-hour, and then they're just sort of released out into the yogaverse and dropped to figure it out on their own, which is, again, irresponsible. So if somebody can be a very inexperienced yogi and then enter a 200-hour program, do it all online, graduate that 200-hour program, and get Yoga Alliance's stamp of approval as you are now qualified, according to Yoga Alliance, to teach yoga. And yet somebody who's been practicing and teaching for 30 or 40 years and who is trained classically can't be Yoga Alliance registered, they can't get that stamp of approval, then I would argue that stamp of approval means jack squat. So there you go. The other problem with the Yoga Alliance, as far as registering if you are a school, so if you want to offer continuing ed, which I do, I offer continuing education, or if you want to run a teacher training program, they're constantly changing the standards and it can get expensive, especially as people who are not American. It's another problem I have with Yoga Alliance. It's very American centric, meaning if you live in the United States, you get some of the benefits of Yoga Alliance, like discounts on insurance and this and some of the other things that they offer. But that's not worldwide. The Yoga Alliance insurance doesn't cover me as a Canadian. So if I were to register, I don't get that discount on insurance. I don't get the discount on some of the other things that they offer. Sure, I'd be able to take the webinars, but you can take webinars and do trainings for your business all over the place. It doesn't need to be through Yoga Alliance. Now, I will give credit where credit is due. One thing that I will say about Yoga Alliance that they did well was there was a point, and I don't know the dates, where there was a few states in the United States that were trying to license becoming a yoga teacher so that they could control sort of, having these run through certain colleges and having to have a licensure. And as a yoga community, there was a lot of uproar about that, about, the government colleges coming in and sort of taking over yoga education and yoga training and yoga teachers. Rightfully so. And so Yoga Alliance did the fundraising and the legal work with the lawyers to quash that in its place. So for that, Yoga Alliance, I will give you kudos. Thank you for that. I agree with that. That was very worthwhile. And I think we would be probably in a bit of a mess right now if they hadn't done that. But here's the thing, dear Yoga Alliance. What have you done for us lately? Now, I'm not prepared with statistics and dollar amounts and things like that. Some of my other guests refer to things a little bit more, but this is all information you can find online. Yoga Alliance is also supposedly set up as a non-for-profit, yet they have a crap ton of money in the bank. And the other thing that I would love to call Yoga Alliance out on, which is sort of recent, is Yoga Alliance as an organization has all of these funds. And yet when we were going through COVID and studio after studio was being shut down either temporarily or permanently going out of business, and yoga teachers were wondering where the hell they were going to get their grocery money and their rent money from, where was Yoga Alliance with this big balloon surplus of money that they have? Did they have an opportunity to apply for bursaries? No. Did they step in and offer studios support? No. Did the teacher training programs run through studios that had been registering with Yoga Alliance year after year after year and paying our dues get any help with that when they were no longer able to teach in person or keep their doors open? No. So non-for-profit technically, but not in the way that we think of it often. Most of us, I think of a non-for-profit as a do-gooder, right? Something that's out there in the world, changing the world, investing, trying to create a better world. And I would argue Yoga Alliance just isn't doing that. So to be clear, Yoga Alliance is not a governing body. You're going to hear this time and time again. Yoga Alliance is not a governing body. They cannot control who teaches yoga. They do not control who is qualified to teach yoga. You could be a very underqualified teacher, a brand new teacher, and get their stamp on your certificate. And yet, you could also be a very overqualified teacher compared to their standards, who's been teaching for years and years and years and years, and training teachers for years and years and years and years, decades of experience, and not qualify for that stamp of approval on your certificates. And this, my friends, is where the problem is. So the Yoga Alliance standards are too low, in my opinion. And not having grandparenting for established teachers who've been teaching for many decades and have tons of experience, those who want to register, big problem. Now, would I register with them if they brought grandparenting back? No, I wouldn't. Maybe at a time I would have, like early on when I was kind of looking into it. But here's what I've realized. In all of my now 20 years of teaching yoga, I have not once had anyone ask me if I am Yoga Alliance registered. Not one studio, not one gym, not one private therapeutic class that I teach, not a single one of them has asked me if I am Yoga Alliance registered. In fact, for the studios who do know what Yoga Alliance is, my many years of experience and my hundreds and hundreds of hours of training, that's what they're looking at. For private therapeutic classes that I teach, for example, for mental health and things like that through government organizations, they're not looking at whether or not I'm Yoga Alliance certified. They don't even know what the heck Yoga Alliance is. I've never once had a yoga student say, "Are you Yoga Alliance registered?" Because guess what? Your students also don't know what the hell Yoga Alliance is. The only people that know what Yoga Alliance is are yoga teachers. So, dear yoga teacher, if you want to register with Yoga Alliance because you feel like that's going to give you a better chance at getting jobs, I would question that. I would question that. I know there are some studios that might require that, but I also think that if that comes up, that's a great opportunity for education to the studio to say, I'm not registered with them, even though this is my experience and here's my training, because I don't believe in them. Now, that being said, a lot of those same studios that require Yoga Alliance credentialing in order for you to teach there also require you to take their teacher training program. So they're not even going to look at your resume unless you've been through their program, which still doesn't guarantee that you're actually going to get a job at that studio. That's a rant for a whole other time. But I just want to mention that, you can go your own way, to quote Fleetwood Mac. You can go your own way, dear yoga teacher. You do not need to register with Yoga Alliance. Yoga Alliance only has the power that we as yoga industry professionals give them with our dollars and our buying into it. If you boycott, if you go, no, you know what? I don't believe in this organization. I don't think it's doing good in the world. So I'm not going to give you my dollars because there's no point. There are more and more people that are doing this now. There are more and more, just Google, why I quit Yoga Alliance or why I stopped registering with Yoga Alliance. You're going to find a whole bunch of blogs and websites and articles from teachers that once were registered and have decided not to continue. So there's so many reasons why, even if they did bring in grandparenting now, I would not register. One, because I don't believe in the organization. I don't believe that they have our best interest at heart as yoga professionals. I don't believe in their standards. I think they are way too low and way too slack on whether or not they're actually, whether or not programs are actually even doing the standards, because once you've registered with them and you've got their stamp, there's nobody looking at the teacher training programs to make sure they're actually doing what they're saying they're doing. So the standards are too low. I don't believe that they're doing much good in the world, to be honest, especially as a supposed non-for-profit. I don't believe they're necessary. And I don't believe that their standards make great teachers. So there's a little bit of my personal Yoga Alliance rant. And you'll hear, of course, other stories as well in the next part 2 of this. The other thing, last thing I'll mention too, is because I mentioned a couple times that Yoga Alliance is very American centric, and that might have been confusing, especially if you're American, because you're not thinking about other people's perspectives around the world. But a lot of European countries, and I believe in Australia, have their own registered registry bodies that they can register through. In Canada, we have one. And if you're Canadian, you're listening to this and you didn't know that there is a Canadian Yoga Alliance that is not at all affiliated with Yoga Alliance in the States. There is. You can register with them. And one of the things I like about them is they have many levels, not just this 200, 500 and throw an E in front of it. There's like many levels that you can register for. Also gets you a discount on insurance in Canada, where it's useful for you if you're Canadian. And then, of course, all over Europe, different countries have their own registries, and some countries have nothing. So for countries like Canada, where typically speaking, our dollar is not as high as the US dollar, for us to continue to register through Yoga Alliance, it actually costs way more than it does in American. That's also something to consider. It can be quite expensive, especially for those studios and teachers that have training programs that are registering again and again with Yoga Alliance over and over, in US dollars, without getting the benefits of some of the perks that you get if you are American. Okay. That's, I think, more than enough of a ramble about why I personally chose not to register with Yoga Alliance. And then I would say, actually, it's gone further than that for me. Now I'm outright boycott Yoga Alliance. I believe as yoga professionals that we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard, and those standards are not good enough. And I also believe as a human and as a longtime activist, that one of the ways that we have some power in the world is to decide where we put our money. And I just don't believe that there is enough good happening with Yoga Alliance for me to put my money there, even if they brought back grandparenting. So I'm also not trying to convince you what you should do, dear yoga teacher. If you find value in registering with Yoga Alliance, if you've heard my story and the other stories in these episodes, if you hear those and it's like no new news for you, like you already knew all this, but you register with Yoga Alliance because you want the discount on clothing or insurance, or you want to attend the webinars and you find value in that, then party on with yourself. You should stay registered. But if you believe that Yoga Alliance is a certifying governing body for yoga, and that you need the Yoga Alliance to be a certified, air quotes, yoga teacher, that's a lie. That's not true. And so you can decide to register with them if you find value with them, or you could decide not to, and you can still be a yoga teacher. Okay, friends. With all of that being said, thank you for listening to my soapboxing. And if you haven't already, I would be so grateful. If you're watching this on YouTube, subscribe and leave me a comment. Let me know. Did I stir some stuff up about Yoga Alliance for you? How do you feel about Yoga Alliance, dear teacher? If you are listening to this either on Apple or Spotify, if you would take 2 minutes and leave me 5 stars for the podcast, I would be so grateful. That helps it show up in the algorithm so that other yin yoga lovers can find this podcast as well. And if you've already done the 5 stars on Apple and you want to leave a written review, I would be so grateful for that as well. Also, feel free to reach out to me and give me suggestions for episodes. like this one was suggested. So if you have questions, topics that you would really love me to dive into, please just reach out. Let me know. You can email me at yoga@nickdanu.com. So nykdanu.com, or you can just get at me on Instagram, send me a DM, and I'm happy to start adding subjects to my list, which is ever growing always here in my phone for the podcast. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. There will be a part 2 to this as well, where I share a couple of other stories from some really amazing long-term seasoned teachers about Yoga Alliance and why they've chosen not to register. All right, until we meet again, have a wonderful day. Bye for now.